and welcome to Reporting In. I'm your host, Malcolm Fleschner. This is the TYT show that is dedicated exclusively to talking to investigative journalists and reporters, discussing the work they're doing, the stories they're covering, find out the story behind the story, and generally find out their perspectives on the important events of the day and other stories they've uncovered. Today on the show, I'm excited to have a return guest. It's Ken Klippenstein, who is a TYT investigator. He's with TYT Investigates as a contributor, and he's also a freelance journalist working elsewhere. Ken, did I forget? Last time you were on, I asked you the correct pronunciation of your last name, and I totally forgot. Is it Klippenstein or Klippenstein?
Stein, like the beer Stein.
Stein, okay. I promise I will try to remember for next time if you agree to come back. So Ken Klippenstein, I apologize. And did I get that right? I mean, you're a freelance journalist, but you also contribute to TYT Investigates. What else do you? Where else can people see your work these days?
Oh, I write for TYT Investigates and the Daily Beast. So those are two main ones.
Okay.
As of right now.
Okay, and but you're still a freelancer.
Yep, I am.
And how do you choose what stories to cover? If you don't have somebody to assign you stories, how do you decide what you're going to cover?
Well, I both get things assigned, but in addition to that, I'm always, I always have my feelers out for whatever's going on. And under this administration, I'm sure, you and the listeners have noticed that we're sort of in warp speed 10 in terms of the news cycle now. So You really have to be, fast on your feet to adapt to whatever the new insane thing that gets thrown at us. So
well, if you go to Ken's Twitter feed, which you definitely should, I think before I commented that you had said that you're a Freedom of Information Act nerd, which is unusual. But you also now you give a phone number or a text that people can use to send you tips, but they have to download a certain app that encrypts it, and it's super secretive. It seems very cool. I'm happy if I get a single retweet, but I'm not. It's not like I'm soliciting these hot tips to uncover all sorts of organized crime or whatever else you're investigating. So I think you're definitely you're kicking it. You're hitting it out of the park in the Twitter realm, and not only just in your your bio and your description, but also in your tweeting. It's very entertaining. So I recommend.
Thank you, I appreciate that.
I recommend Ken as a follow. So there are a lot of things I wanted to talk to you about today. The first is the most recent story you did for TYT Investigates, where you uncovered news that that ICE has been receiving military-style training as well as military-style weaponry. I want to make sure I get it. That their enforcement and removal officers are being trained in the use of M4 assault rifles, chemical agents, stun grenades, and flashbangs, which makes me think maybe they're going to be sent to Ferguson or Standing Rock. But that they also have hired a former CIA interrogator to train agents in handling terrorist suspects, and that they've acquired 8,000 additional M4 rifles than previously, and they've got a $15 million agreement with the M4's manufacturer, which is Colt Firearms, to maintain the rifles. So this is, as you point out in your article, which you can find on TYT Investigates, this is military-style weaponry and training for people whose jobs they're not military, they're not part of the United States Armed Forces, and they are generally, correct me if I'm wrong, they're tasked with enforcing misdemeanor violations.
That's right. People forget that whenever you hear the term, illegal immigration thrown around, often, in proximity to MS-13, ordinary Americans, they're just going to think, picture gangsters.
Yeah.
They're going to picture cartels, things like that. But, the majority of the people being deported aren't, in fact, those. They're just people that were here. They didn't have the proper documents, and that's a misdemeanor offense. That's not even a felony. So, I spoke to a former assistant deputy director of the DHS, very high-ranking official within the DHS. DHS, of course, being the parent, organization, or the parent bureau that oversees ICE. He himself said, these violations are just not that serious. He didn't want me to use his name, but again, I want to stress, how senior and within the mainstream, an assistant deputy director of the DHS is. And so when someone like that says, this isn't a very serious thing, I think people should take that seriously.
So that leads to the speculation, okay, why do they need this? Whose idea is this? And we talked about militarizing the border. That's been a topic of discussion. But ICE doesn't just operate at the border. These are people who operate all over the country. And I mean, we've seen this. Why I referenced Ferguson earlier and Standing Rock. We've seen an increased militarization of typical just urban policing across this country, and there's been a lot of pushback against that. Is this sort of part and parcel with that sort of thing? This is another law enforcement agency, and so we're going to get them all the same war or military type equipment that we've been supplying to just police forces. Because we expect them to be using it, presumably, or maybe it's just a boondoggle, and we're trying to pay off, the gun lobby and the other, or the gun manufacturers and other suppliers of this type of armaments. What's going on? Why? What's the story behind the story? That's what I want to know, Ken.
Well, as with anything, there's many factors, and I feel like everything that you said seems, plausible. But what I'm hearing from people that were formerly, in ICE and other people in law enforcement agencies. They're telling me that what we're seeing right now is a beefing up of ICE, and they speculate that, and I've spoken to a number of DHS folks and FBI and others, and they say that it's not actually coming from internal to DHS. This stuff is coming from the White House. That's what I'm told, and it makes sense because this is consistent with the sort of campaign promises that President Trump made, and so with midterms coming up. One would think that this would be to his benefit to try to have these very vivid policies. I mean, I find them horrifying, but it's hard to argue that they're not getting a ton of airtime and grabbing people's attention. And when the majority of the country doesn't vote, you don't need to turn out that many people, just your particular base, to win these elections. And his base, I'm sure, is seeing all these things. I mean, you can't. I mean, there was a time when you couldn't turn off cable news without seeing a story about, for instance, children being separated from their parents. It's a very vivid policy. And so when I'm told that it's coming from the White House and I see that it's a policy that's getting an enormous amount of attention, I have to assume that there's some sort of political component to it.
Yeah, I mean, it's Donald Trump deservedly gets credit for upending a lot of traditional political, philosophy about what works and what doesn't work. One of which is that you after you win an election, you then sort of move to the center to try to attract as many votes for your re-election from the other side or those who might be wavering independents. And that has not been Donald Trump's approach. He's definitely looking to mollify or excite his base. And so the images that many of us see of the border and families being separated and crying children, all that sort of thing, that horrify us, to a certain segment of the population, that's like, right on. This is what he's delivering on the promises he made. And it seems like what's going on here a little bit is a ramping up of that, and it goes along with how Trump has attempted to conflate undocumented people coming into this country or who are here already with MS-13 and their gangsters. So, it doesn't seem doesn't it seem like there's a conflict there between the images we're seeing of these families being torn apart and Donald Trump saying, well, they're all MS-13, they're animals and they're MS-13. These are like 5-year-old children. It's hard to argue that they are horrible gangsters who are violent. And but I guess if you're capable of the kind of cognitive dissonance that can turn Donald Trump into a reasonable person, a leader, a good businessman, all that sort of thing that he, that people his supporters talk about, then maybe you can buy that too.
Yeah, I want to say something. It's very close to home for me as well. My mother immigrated here from El Salvador, and she was undocumented, and so of course I know people through my family and their friends. And I just want to say to listeners, the people that are most afraid of MS-13 are Salvadorans. The people that most hate them and want them to be gotten rid of. Through whatever legal means we can, those are Salvadorans. So this isn't something that, in this attempt to try to conflate those two groups, they're totally on your side in not wanting MS-13.
Yeah, and that's what I mean. Another one of the ironies is that the people who are at least at risk of suffering gang violence, right, MS-13 or otherwise, are the Donald Trump supporters in the Midwest and these rural voters. The more exposure people get to actual immigrants in this country who are contributing and doing all the things that immigrants are actually doing as opposed to what they're accused of doing, the less likely you're going to be to support Donald Trump. So
exactly. But his whole thing is driving these wedges and not finding what common interests people have that they can try to pursue. And I mean, if you look at the history of MS-13, it's a sort of instructive case. These were many refugees from either El Salvador or some from Mexico. And so we're looking at, kicking people out. But another policy that would help is how do we make it so that, we don't have these failed states that people are fleeing from? To what extent can we, treat refugees in a way that's going to, ensure that they don't have to turn to, illicit activities to try to, be able to feed themselves and their families. So I think that's something else that unfortunately I don't think the current administration has either level of insight or maturity to, discuss. But it's something that at some point we probably will have to.
So you're suggesting that Donald Trump, the current Trump administration, is not reflecting on the after effects of the 1980s and the funding of death squads, and then the ongoing drug war that has brought this just unheard of violence to countries like Honduras and El Salvador and Guatemala. Also, support for a coup in Honduras recently. These are things that contribute. You're suggesting if you're looking at root causes, maybe that's what we should be investigating, as opposed to just giving more M4 rifles to our ICE officers. That's what you're saying?
I have this crazy idea that we've kind of used force for a while, and how great has it turned out? I mean, the crime rate is down, but we still have serious systemic problems all over the country. And I see it as I see Central America as sort of a mirror image of what we're seeing happening in Syria. Not to say that the two are the same, there are many differences. But, when you have a failed state, you have a huge refugee flow, and then you have to determine how you're going to handle that. And, you can either handle it rationally and try to integrate, people into society to ensure that, they don't resort to antisocial things. Or you can, meet them with force and with, racial enmity and with violence, and that's just going to beget more of that. So I feel we don't face a lot of the consequences of misadventures in the Middle East because there's the ocean between us. But Europe is facing that right now, and to a great extent, that's what we're seeing in Central America as well. Because the majority of people coming here, they're not from Mexico; they're from Guatemala, El Salvador. These areas where significant civil wars and military operations happened. So it seems to reflect it really well. And I think if you want to, not have refugee flows, maybe don't try not to contribute to generating refugees, I think. Yeah,
I guess it seemed like the best case scenario, I suppose. Looking at this, you give the local police forces, tanks and armored personnel carriers or whatever else you're outfitting them with, and they're going to want to use them. And so you get they'll get the wrong address, they'll demolish a guy's house, kill people, and so that's a real consequence. The best case scenario is this is just sort of theater, and we're trying to Trump and the White House want to make a show for their supporters, and if some weapons manufacturers make a little extra money on the side, great. There's no downside. But what seems like is inevitable is that these weapons get used. Terrorist suspect training for handling terrorist suspects. Do they believe their own rhetoric about these refugees coming across, these people seeking asylum, fleeing violence, that they are really terrorist suspects? I mean, it's hard to imagine even they believe that.
Well, I'll tell you this. I talked to former ICE agents and active, they don't believe it, or at least significant numbers of them don't. One should distinguish, when we say ICE, there's not a whole lot of understanding of what that means. There's largely two components. One is called Homeland Security Investigations, HSI for short. The other one is called Enforcement and Removal Operations. HSI have far more training. Enforcement and removal, these are the folks that people think of when they think of ICE. They have far less training. They don't have operational training. They don't know, by and large, how to conduct investigations. They're not actually tasked with doing any of that. When Trump says, we need ICE to crack down, that's not actually in their mission.
Yeah.
The FBI is the only agency that's supposed to handle terror issues. So if he wanted to, beef up our counterterror response, the correct way to do would be, you can have whatever use you have on law enforcement, but the proper way to do that would be through FBI. So these guys, that's not even in their jurisdiction. So when you talk to them, and I spoke to several, they seemed as shocked as I was that they'd been training. When I spoke to former people, that they'd been training them in these methods, because they say, they should just hand those cases over to FBI. They don't have the experience to even do that, even if they wanted to investigate things. As enforcement removal officers were described to me by a former ICE agent, they're basically just glorified cops. They just grab a guy, they put him in a paddy wagon, they bring him to some processing facility to determine, what's gonna happen to him, and that's all they do. They're not supposed to handle. So you mentioned before, you're seeing these M4s. That's the standard issue rifle that M4s are being given to ICE in huge numbers. They doubled their quantity. They're doubling their quantity of it. That's a standard military issue rifle for the Marine Corps. So to have a domestic agency, first of all, and second of all, a like generally poorly trained agency have these weapons of war. They also have crowd suppressants, tear gas. We have the SWAT team for that. We have the FBI for that. We have so many other groups that, first of all, are better trained to handle those things, and second of all, frankly, have probably a lot more public trust than ICE enjoys at this point in time, or in general too. So I should say, much of ICE was as shocked as I was. Certainly, the better trained and better educated ones seem to be.
I guess the worst case scenario then is, I mean, that Donald Trump doesn't want to use the FBI because he doesn't trust the FBI, and he would rather beef up and build up his own personal police force that he feels like he can control, whereas he feels like the FBI is, not necessarily on his side. But I guess we'll just have to wait and see. I mean, I don't know where you stand, but I'm with Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez in the Abolish ICE campaign. I'm in the Abolish ICE camp. So ideally, we will make all of them former ICE officers, or at least retrain them to do whatever. I'm getting farther afield, but we're almost. I don't know how much time we have, Irma. What's our? Irma wasn't ready for that. We got like 5 minutes left. So before we go, I wanted to get to a little bit more of some of the more current stories that you're if not covering, at least following, because I love to get your perspective on these things. And one of them that is sort of an ongoing story is the Civility Olympics, I like to call it, where we're competing to see who, what is acceptable, what's not acceptable, what's allowed, what's not allowed. And then with the most recent Supreme Court nomination, there seems to be a beefing up of this because this guy, Kavanaugh, is such an establishment figure that, and it's going to be a lightning rod for the left to criticize him, and it seems like the right is gearing up to really ramp up the, hey, we have to be civil here, while this guy potentially condemns thousands of women to death. How do you view this when there's so many norms being violated and criticisms? You can't go and interrupt Sarah Huckabee Sanders when she's eating dinner, or Stephen Miller when he's having sushi, and so on and so forth. Do you think that the critics of the administration have gone too far, or do you think this is perfectly acceptable nowadays?
Well, the people that are saying they need to be more civil are the same people that are, literally starving Yemen to death. Try, asking a Yemeni what they think about it, the Trump administration's views on civility. Ask a Honduran what they think about it. Ask any of the people that we're splitting up right now. So it's interesting to me that the civility is always demanded for the most powerful people who can defend themselves and, have literal bodyguards to protect them and all these other things. Where is the concern for civility on the part of the weak that can't defend themselves, who, really are on the receiving end of a lot of these nasty policies? So I think it's totally cynical. I think it's hypocritical. And frankly, I just laugh whenever I see it, whenever I see the term brought up by anyone defending the administration.
Well, one thing that just recently today, as we're recording this, or maybe it was yesterday, we have Elon Musk, and you were sort of giving him a hard time on Twitter, who was sort of complaining that every time he gets called a billionaire, it's like they say it with there's a negative tone. It's like, a guy can't even be a billionaire now without being criticized. It's like, no, you can't, Elon. I find that amusing. But one thing, I don't know if you share this perspective, but I'll throw it by you, which is that we see all these viral videos of, like the woman wearing the Puerto Rico T-shirt who was accosted, the picnic area where she was getting ready to have a birthday party, or the 8-year-old girl who was selling water in San Francisco and has to get the police called on her, or threatened to be called on her. And it seems to me that the right, they're more interested, or people who are these sort of incidents, when when people of the right are the instigators, it's to criticize or attack people who have very little power. And when it's on the left, it's criticism of people who have a lot of power. So the civility, it's interesting who we feel it's appropriate to direct our criticism towards, and who deserves it. And am I right? Do you think that is that like that on the left we're speaking truth to power, or trying to make power responsive to the people, whereas on the right it's more about just kicking people who are already beneath them?
Yeah, and unfortunately, I'm afraid this suffuses the culture too. A lot of comedy, unfortunately, is pretty reactionary in character and tends to mock the weak. And I'm just citing this as an example. I've always found the best comedy to be, the jester is supposed to make fun of the king. He's not supposed to make fun of the poor bastard in the stocks.
Right.
And unfortunately, that's not just what we see in comedy. I think that's something that, like I said, sort of suffuses the culture too. I don't know that there's a whole lot of consciousness around the fact that some people sort of run the country and a very large number of people kind of follow their orders, in a sort of metaphoric sense. So yeah, I do think there's a great deal of naivete and even ignorance about that.
And so we only have like a minute left, but looking forward to Brett Kavanaugh, maybe I'm cynical and I've seen it too often, but I don't see anything but him just sailing through and being on the Supreme Court by the fall, and a lot of Sturm and Drang about, well, maybe we can get Susan Collins, maybe we can get Lisa Murkowski, and we have to keep all the Democrats in that, and then eventually, oh, we were so close, we couldn't quite do it, just like it always seems to happen. Am I right? Is that what's going to happen? Or what do you think? What's your prediction for this Supreme Court nomination?
That's my assessment as well. What I think the question is how are the Democrats, when they, obtain power again, how will they respond to that? Because if they don't respond in a novel fashion, perhaps of the sort that FDR tried to, we're going to see far right-wing dominance of this institution for the next 30 years at least, I assume. So the question to me isn't what the Republicans are going to do. It's pretty clear. I share your point of view. They're going to get the seat. The question is, how will the left and how will the Democrats respond?
So you're a pack the court guy. I mean, that's after 2020. You got to elect a Democrat and then have that person. But that presumes that the Democrats really want to fight and really want to resist and they're willing to explode norms just like the Republicans do, which I haven't seen really an inclination to do that.
You're right to be pessimistic. I'm just saying, I'm trying to think about how could this possibly turn out in a way that's not catastrophic, and maybe that's a small possibility.
All right, well, Ken, thank you so much for talking to me today. I appreciate it. There's more I would love to get to with you, but we only have 22 minutes for these episodes, so hopefully I'll be able to talk to you again in the future. But for you at home, thank you for tuning in. I appreciate your watching Reporting In. I'm Malcolm Fleschner. I love to bring you the stories that reporters are working on all around the globe. And every week I'll do this once a week. And let me know if you have stories that you'd like me to cover, or journalists you'd like me to interview who are covering important stories and doing great work, because I'm all ears and I'm eager to hear it. But in the meantime, thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next time in Reporting In.